The voice of the creative economy, Vincent Heeringa, joining us now from idealogue.co.nz. Good morning, Vincent.
Good morning, Wamm. That's a pretty rip-snorting riff.
Rip, snort and rip. Oh, yeah, it certainly is, rock and roll. It's good to hear from the Dadsons once again.
Oh, I reckon. That's a great track.
Yeah, good stuff. I'm looking forward to an album coming out soon. But what's got you thinking this week?
Well, I was looking at the asset sales discussion and thinking, what's a right-thinking man to think about such things? You know, are we ripping off ourselves by selling our assets, or is it wise use of our resources and a good way to kind of get some new investment in this economy?
It's certainly an emotional topic.
It is an emotional and ramped up by Labour, who are using it to run a very effective campaign, I think, about I guess about sovereignty and about New Zealand's sense of who they are, and playing up quite well on the disasters of the 80s and 90s in terms of asset sales. But you know, there's also a lot of hype and hysteria around this, Wammo, and shall I tell you what I think?
Yeah.
No, go on then.
Go ahead.
I never thought you'd ask. It seems to me that we do have a great opportunity with asset sales to inject some fresh money into the economy. New Zealanders are dreadful savers. We don't invest in long-term equities. We invest in property and in lotto. And property so far has been pretty good until recent times. Lotto, not so much.
For a few people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if this is a way of stimulating a savings culture, then I think it's got to be a good thing. If you look across the ditch, they have a fantastic track record in saving through compulsory super. And their sovereign fund is now something like, I believe it's in the trillions, that has invested in infrastructure and Australian assets. And so if this could be a trigger for organisations such as iwi or individuals like you and me, or institutions, even overseas institutions, to gain greater ownership of these assets and inject fresh capital into them, I can't see how that is a bad thing.
Why do asset sales, why do you think asset sales would promote a saving culture as opposed to, say, the bank, which has always been there?
Because just making cash deposits is not the same as owning assets. Owning assets is a risky business, so your assets can vanish. Your bank is a much more reliable, I suppose, institution for holding cash. But what happens with assets, of course, is that they increase in value. Well, that's the theory. And by investing in assets, we not only support the New Zealand economy, but we have potential to grow our wealth. And this is not just the wealth of the individuals, but actually of the institutions that invest in those things. So
the objection really doesn't come about New Zealanders owning our own natural resource assets. The objection comes from the fact that those assets could fall into overseas hands.
Yes, and the government have put some limits around that. They've said, for one thing, that no one organisation or institution can own more than 10%. And nor can the total non-government ownership exceed 49%. So there are some quite strict constraints around that to protect those things from happening.
But we do know that the money men are very smart, and they know how to fiddle things so that they have a selection of companies. That company can own 8% over there. That company can own another 7% over there. But there, before you know it, you've got around 30%.
I think that would be an amazing feat, given the level of anxiety that the government and people have about this. You could be right, Wammo. There might be clever ways of doing it.
It's anxiety now, right? But the memory fades very quick, and this thing happens incrementally over time, doesn't it?
I suppose it does, but maybe. It's so hard to talk about counterfactuals when the reality is that we have these constraints in front of us. What's being proposed seems to me to be an eminently conservative state asset sales program. And let's face it, it actually has worked incredibly well in Australia, where when they sold their telco to become Telstra and sold their airline. Well, it still continues as Qantas, but what they did was sold only half, and so the minority stake injected new capital, but the ownership was retained by the state.
But don't New Zealanders, by and large, have the experience that when stuff falls into private ownership, it doesn't work out as well as we expected? When some of the power companies were privatised, we had a total mess at the end of the 90s with the electricity industry, and then you look back at telecom and what happened with telecom. New Zealanders have been ripped off for years by them, and so we've just got this bad taste in our mouths with privatisation.
I agree that there is a bad taste, and the experience in parts has been spectacularly bad. And you think about the disaster of Air New Zealand buying Ansett and the poor management of that organisation. But actually, let's take telecom. The problem with telecom was not the deregulation. Telecommunications improved out of sight when telecom became a company as opposed to being the post office. And services and investment improved incredibly thanks to privatisation, where new capital and a kind of market incentive was put in. The problem with telecom was not the privatisation, it was the regulation of the telco market. And that continues to today, and we actually still suffer the legacy of bad rules around telecom. But you can't blame the privatisation for that. Actually, privatisation was terrific for all of us in terms of telco use. But absolutely by your point, Wemo, that we did privatisation reasonably badly in New Zealand. We pioneered it, actually, and the Aussies went slower and smarter and learnt the lessons. And I just think, we've got to give this idea a chance because, and not suffer from the hysteria of what is being, generated by the Greens and Labour.
But what about the fact that that this is also a short-term plan? Sure, there is this element of getting New Zealanders to invest into assets, and hopefully those New Zealanders will reap those rewards further down the track. But you must remember at the same time that this is only a select few New Zealanders. This isn't everyone. This certainly isn't my mum and dad, and it's certainly not me. So these assets are going to fall into the hands probably of predominantly the rich of New Zealand, right? And we're going to get this cash injection. The government is going to get this cash injection in the short term. But what about in the long term? The loss of the potential, profits from these businesses down the future, the future dividends that we were going to get from these businesses.
Sure. Well, I think there are two issues in what you said. One is, not everyone can invest. Well, actually, everyone can invest, and when things float on the share market, it is possible for ordinary people to form syndicates. It's possible for iwi and for investment institutions. The only kind of investment.
But to be honest, Vincent, for most people, that's not even part of their vocabulary. It's just not part of their sphere. That's not what they do.
That's kind of my point, is that it does make this part of people's vocab. And actually, if we want to be a sovereign nation, then we actually need to have an ownership stake in it, not just the state, but as individuals and institutions. So actually introducing some of that language and ideas back into our vocab has got to be a good thing.
I just think that it's going to happen, that they'll go for sale, and it'll happen overnight, and it'll fall into all these particular hands. People are already familiar with investing already in shares and whatnot, and everyone else will just sort of watch from the sidelines. That's how I think it's going to roll out.
You remind me a little bit of people who are worried about the World Cup. As if we'd joke. Surely not.
Good talking about this, and it certainly obviously is going to be hotly debated as we get closer to the election as well. No doubt we'll talk about this again. Thanks, Vincent.
Pleasure, Wemo.
Vincent Heeringa. More from Vincent over at idealogue.co.nz.